Okay, we've gotten the all clear from Tab. I'm going to go ahead and turn both my audio and my video off. As a reminder, please reach out via cell phone number, either via text or phone call if you get kicked out during the round. Best of luck to both teams.
All right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
We are now ready to begin proceedings, today's trial. Just give me a moment to make sure that my materials are set up here. And they are. Okay, we've received the message to get started. We'll call the case of Stevie Rogers v. Drew Mars. My name is Judge Mike Romano. I see that the parties have changed the name settings on your Zoom accounts to indicate yours. For some reason, I do not seem to have the full functionality that will let me change mine, but it should be easy for at least everyone to remember who I am. So scoring judges, it does not appear that anyone's video is showing, but just in case, please look to the two buttons in the lower left of your screen and remember to keep your audio and video off unless the bailiff tells you otherwise. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants, which means that only people on the screen right now should be the advocates who will be handling pretrial matters and myself. So before we begin with any pretrial matters, would the attorneys please make appearances, starting with the plaintiff first?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Fabrice Guillaume, and I, along with my co-counsel, Ms. Remington Hill.
Good morning, Your Honor.
We represent the plaintiff in today's case, Mr. Stevie Rogers.
Good morning, Mr. Rogers. Good morning, counsel.
A few pretrial matters, Your Honor.
Yes.
First, the plaintiff invokes Rule 603, which calls for the constructive swearing in of all witnesses who will be providing testimony today.
All right, all witnesses will be considered sworn.
We also invoke Rule 615, which calls for the constructive sequestration of all witnesses, barring a party representative. The plaintiff's party representative will be Stevie Rogers.
Excellent. And we'll come to the defense side when we get to their pretrial matters. Actually, before we continue with anything else that you have, if we can have introductions from the defense.
Yes, Your Honor.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Mason Baruki, and I, along with my co-counsel, Mr. Spencer Richardson.
Good morning, Your Honor.
We represent the defendant, Ms. Drew Mars.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, Ms. Mars. All right, so now that introductions are taken care of, the plaintiff, I imagine, has some additional pretrial matters that you would like to cover.
Yes, Your Honor. We'd also like to direct your attention to evidentiary ruling 17, which is on the third page of the packet you've received. It states that exhibits, sorry?
You said the third page and ruling 17. Hang on just a second. Yes.
It states that exhibits 1 through 7 have been pre-admitted and may be used at any time throughout trial.
Okay.
Lastly, Your Honor, since we've never had the pleasure of appearing in your virtual courtroom, we wanted to ask for your preference about displaying exhibits. When exhibits haven't been entered into evidence yet, should we ask permission before displaying, or may we assume that they've been constructively outside of the view of the jury until they're admitted into evidence?
I think, given the constraints that we're all under, it would be best to treat them as we would normally treat objections constructively at sidebar, which is also totally fine for the purposes of this trial, and to treat them as constructively outside the purposes of the jury until they are received in evidence.
Yes, Your Honor. With that, plaintiff's ready for trial.
All right. Any further pretrial matters from the defense?
Yes, just one from the defense, Your Honor. If I could direct your attention to stipulation 35.
All right, where is that in the materials? Stipulation 35, page 4. Okay, I see it.
Yes, stipulation 35 notes that Ms. Drew Mars had already been tried for the murder of Agatha Lee in a criminal court, and that these charges were dropped. We'd like to make the court aware of that.
Okay.
And with that, the defense is ready to proceed.
All right. There are just a couple of matters that I want to address before we get started. First of all, we've been advised to make sure that witnesses all have access to their affidavits so that there isn't any needless delay in the event that witnesses either need to have their memories refreshed or that one party or the other attempts an impeachment. Would you confirm whether your witnesses all do have their affidavits handy in a separate tab or screen on their computer?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, for timekeeping, given the number of people that will display on the screen at any given time, I would just ask that after each segment of the case where time will be kept, since we won't have a timekeeper on screen for you all to have easy reference to, the timekeepers confer and apprise each other of how much time they are showing that the competitors have remaining, and time can be entered whether privately or collectively to the group, depending on timekeepers' preferences, into the chat window, unless the parties have any other suggestions about how you wanted to handle time being kept.
That's amenable to the plaintiff, Your Honor.
As for the defense.
Okay, excellent. So we're ready to proceed then with opening statements.
May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury. I want you to imagine that we're in an old mansion in the woods. A grandmother has just fallen asleep in her bed. When out of the darkness, a woman starts tiptoeing down the hallway towards that grandmother's room, holding 2 deadly pills. She slips those pills into the grandmother's pillbox. So when the grandmother unknowingly takes them, her heart stops beating and she dies. Members of the jury, that grandmother was Agatha Lee. The famous mystery novelist we all know and love, whose imagination captured the hearts and minds of readers across the country. That woman who creeped into Miss Lee's room in the night, it was the person who was supposed to be taking care of her. The defendant in today's case, Drew Mars. Members of the jury, you'll learn that Miss Mars wanted to keep control of Miss Lee's $20 million inheritance. So she used her knowledge as Miss Lee's caretaker to come up with what she thought was the perfect plan. You're going to learn that at the center of that plan were those deadly pills. Because without those pills, the defendant was going to lose the will. Now, in Midlands, if you kill somebody, you can't collect their inheritance, even if you're written into their will. That's why we brought this lawsuit against the defendant. To show you that the defendant is not entitled to Miss Lee's inheritance, we'll have to show you that she purposefully took Miss Lee's life. Now, this is a civil trial, not a criminal trial, which means that we have to prove that to you by a preponderance of the evidence. That just means more likely than not. To meet that responsibility, we're going to show you that without those pills, the defendant was going to lose the will. Now, to do that, I'd like to take a step back and give us a full picture of what happened. We're going to hear from Madeline Bond, a private investigator. She'll tell us that Miss Lee was worth $20 million, but the defendant wasn't. She needed Miss Lee's money. Her family back home was struggling to make ends meet. She had a sibling who was going to die without Miss Lee's money. But for the time being, everything would be okay. Miss Lee had written the defendant into her will. So when Miss Lee died, the defendant would get the mansion, the book proceeds, and $20 million in savings, all of it. All she had to do was wait. That all changed when Miss Lee's beloved grandson, Stevie Rogers, came into the picture. We'll call Mr. Rogers to the stand. He'll tell you that Miss Lee began to reconnect with her grandson. He'll tell us that he was away for a few years, dealing with the loss of his parents in a car accident. But when he came back to see his gams, it was just like old times. They played backgammon, they chatted about the latest news, they drank tea. After a few months, Miss Lee realized family comes first. So she told Mr. Rogers she was going to change her will. You'll hear that the defendant overheard that conversation and realized she had to act. If Miss Lee changed the will, the defendant and her family would end up broke and her sibling would die. Members of the jury, you're going to hear that as Miss Lee's nurse, the defendant knew Miss Lee was deathly allergic to a drug called chlorandramine. It's a common drug you can buy over the counter at a pharmacy, but it was poisonous to Miss Lee. You're also going to hear that the defendant knew Miss Lee took 2 pills every day that looked identical to chlorandramine in shape, size, and color. So she came up with what she thought was a perfect plan. That night, the defendant was going to sneak into Miss Lee's room, swap her daily meds with those deadly pills. Miss Lee would die before she could change the will, and the defendant would get the book proceeds, the house, the $20 million, all of it. Because without those pills, the defendant was going to lose the will. Members of the jury, throughout today's case, I want you to keep 3 questions in mind. First, who knew about the similarities between Miss Lee's daily meds and those deadly pills before she died? Second, in whose room did the police find chlorandramine? And third, who stood to inherit $20 million if Miss Lee died? Members of the jury, you're going to hear that only the defendant knew Miss Lee would mistake her daily meds for those deadly pills. You're going to hear that only the defendant was found in possession of chlorandramine. You're going to hear that only the defendant needed Miss Lee dead, because only the defendant was going to lose that will without those pills. Now that's why at the end of today's trial, my colleague, Miss Remington Hill, is going to stand before you. She'll walk you through the evidence and she'll tell you that this defendant took Miss Lee's life. She'll ask that you don't let her take her money too. She'll ask you to return a verdict of guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Counsel for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
This is Drew Mars. You'll hear today that Miss Mars was a caretaker for 10 years, and that she spent her adult life providing not just for her family, but providing comfort for Agatha Lee as well. Make no mistake, members of the jury, Miss Mars is not a killer. And now you see, opposing counsel just got up here and they told you that today's case is about greed and a hunger for money. But what they didn't tell you, what they don't want you to know, is that the reason we are here in court is because the author, Agatha Lee, wanted to write the end of her own story. You see, the opposing counsel might point fingers at Drew Mars all day today, but the truth is another tragedy has occurred. You see, Agatha Lee didn't die at the hands of Drew Mars, but rather she took her own life on August 14th. She wrote the end of her own story. You're going to hear about 2 different Agatha Lees during trial today. There was one that was friendly, energetic, full of life. And she was a private woman who only let certain people into her inner circle. But you'll hear that above all else, Agatha Lee was a proud woman who cherished her independence. And for over 80 years, this was the Agatha Lee that her friends and her family knew and loved. But you'll also hear that in the summer of 2018, something changed. And this second Agatha, well, she was quieter, more introverted, and she was dealing with the health problems that accompany old age. Nonetheless, Miss Lee was still that same independent woman who cherished her independence. And rather than deal with the declining health and a declining demeanor, she decided to write the end of her own life and take back control. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this second Agatha Lee today, because you're going to hear witness after witness explain this notable change in Miss Lee's character and her health. And it'll become clear why Miss Lee wanted to write the end of her own story. Now, the plaintiff has the burden of proof in today's case, and they have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that Drew Mars purposely or knowingly killed Agatha Lee. But as you sit through trial today, it'll become pretty clear that opposing counsel simply cannot meet this burden. Now, we as the defense don't hold a burden. Now, we don't have to call any witnesses or provide any evidence, but we will. Today, you're going to hear from two witnesses who will introduce you to Agatha Lee and explain why this woman would want to write the end of her own story. First, you're going to hear from Drew Mars. Miss Mars is going to walk you through her 10 years of experience as Miss Lee's caretaker and tell you that in the weeks and days leading up to August 14th, Miss Lee's attitude and her health had declined. Miss Mars is going to walk you through that final day on August 14th and explain that Miss Lee was acting different, unusual even. Now, next, you're going to hear from Ryan Cabrera, an author who is compiling a biography of Agatha Lee. Relying on over 6 months of interviews, Mr. Cabrera is going to take you behind the scenes and give you a sneak peek at Agatha Lee and her behavior at these interviews. Mr. Cabrera is going to tell you face to face that Miss Lee was one way when the interviews began in February of 2018, but by the last interview in August, she was a completely different person. Listen as Mr. Cabrera explains just why that last meeting with Agatha Lee on August 14th was ominous, given what would happen just a few hours later. Now, members of the jury, it's certainly no contention today that a tragedy's occurred. And at the end of trial, no one really wins. The plaintiff has lost a grandmother, and Drew Mars has lost a friend of over 10 years. And I anticipate both of them would tell you that no amount of money and no inheritance could possibly make up for the loss of Agatha Lee. But we cannot simply compound this tragedy by holding an innocent person guilty of a crime that she just didn't commit. And that's why at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Mason Baruki, will come before you, remind you of the evidence that you've heard today, remind you why Agatha Lee would want to write the end of her own story, and I'll ask that you find Miss Mars not liable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, counsel. I'll give the scoring judges a moment to make sure that we have ballots completed. And now, before the plaintiff calls its first witness, I will ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. This will allow everyone to see the attorneys and witnesses at the same time. And now, plaintiff, we're ready for you to call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers to the stand.
All right, Ms. Hill, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Can you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hi, I'm Stevie Rogers.
Mr. Rogers, you're the plaintiff in today's case. So can you tell us why you're suing Drew Mars?
My grandmother died 2 years ago, and it's Drew's fault.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about your grandmother?
Sure. Nana she was the best. I mean, she used to pick me up after school. She let me watch Law and Order, even though she knew it would give me nightmares. When I did eventually get nightmares, she'd be there for me. We had the best relationship. We had the best relationship until I lost my parents a few years ago.
Mr. Rogers, what happened a few years ago when you lost your parents?
12 years ago, I lost my parents to a drunk driver. After that happened, I remember thinking to myself, Nana was the only person left in my life, so I tried. I tried to be her little Stevie. But every time I saw her, I was just reminded of my mom's face. So I stopped talking to her, distanced myself, tried to make a life of my own.
Were you ever able to reconnect with your grandmother?
Yes. In May of 2018, Netflix put up Law and Order on the website, and I was reminded of all the times I didn't spend with Nana. So I packed up my things, I drove down to Alabama where she used to live, and I tried to find her. But she wasn't there.
Did you ever find her?
I did. I hired someone to help me find her, and eventually we found her right here in Midlands.
When was that, Mr. Rogers?
That was back in July of 2018.
What'd you do when you found your grandmother in Midlands in July?
I moved in. I mean, at first I wasn't sure how long I was going to be there, but she said she missed me, and I saw the lines on her face, and I realized I needed to make up for lost time.
Did your grandmother live alone?
No, she lived with Drew Mars.
Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with the defendant, Ms. Drew Mars?
I mean, it was fine at first. I was grateful that she was doing things that needed to be done in the house.
Things like what?
Like, she would always fill Nana's pill organizer every Saturday.
Your Honor, let the record reflect that I'll be displaying on screen what's been previously marked as Exhibit 12, constructively outside the view of the jury.
All right, that's fine.
Mr. Rogers, is this the pillbox that Drew Mars would fill?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, let the record reflect that I'll be reading onto the record a portion of Exhibit 2, which is already in evidence.
All right, that's fine.
From the conclusion. It is my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that the sole and conclusive cause of subject's death was a fatal allergic reaction to 2 chloroandramine pills. Now, Mr. Rogers, did you know your grandmother was allergic to chloroandramine?
I did.
How'd you know that?
Well, Drew told me about it.
Well, I want to fast forward to the day before your grandmother was found dead. When was that?
That was August 14th, that same year, 2018.
Can you describe that day for us?
Sure. I remember waking up early that morning. I remember going down to the kitchen, making Nana's favorite breakfast, and then eating it with her at the study.
Did you and your grandmother speak over breakfast?
We did. We talked about politics. We talked about backgammon from the night before. I'd won again. And we talked about the will.
Did you know what was in your grandmother's will when you had that conversation?
Not the details. Nana told me that it was in Drew's name, but she was going to change that.
Do you know how she was going to do that?
She said she was going to call her lawyers.
And did she tell you why she planned on calling her lawyers to change her will?
She did. She said that she was happy we reconnected, and I mean, I was too.
Do you know if the defendant heard your grandmother say that she was happy that you reconnected and that she was going to change the will?
I don't know. She was standing right outside the door when I was leaving, though.
What was the defendant doing?
She was glaring at me.
Other than glaring at you, was the defendant doing anything else?
Her fists were clenched.
So while the defendant glared at you with their fists clenched, did she say anything?
She looked me in the eyes and she said, "No way."
Mr. Rogers, now that we know what the defendant said, I want to talk about what they did. Did you see the defendant on the night of August 14th?
I did. I saw her at around 9:35, 9:40.
Well, I want to make sure I've got it exactly right. Your Honor, let the record reflect that I'll be revealing to the jury an enlarged copy of what's already in evidence as Exhibit 5. Mr. Rogers, what are we looking at here?
This is a layout of the second floor of Nana's house.
Using the diagram, can you tell us where you saw Drew at around 9:40 p.m. on August 14th?
Drew was outside where it says Mars's bedroom. Right there, yes.
Did you see where the defendant went?
She was walking towards Nana's bedroom, so where it says Agatha's bedroom on the top right corner, right there.
So when you saw the defendant heading from their bedroom towards your grandmother's bedroom, did you see if she was carrying chloroandramine pills?
I don't know, but I saw her holding something in her hands like that.
Your Honor, let the record reflect that Mr. Rogers is holding up his right hand with his palm up and his fingers closed.
You will.
So, Mr. Rogers, when you saw the defendant holding something in their right hand and walking from their bedroom to your grandmother's, did you do anything?
No. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I thought it was weird, but no.
What about the next morning?
I woke up to Drew pounding on my door, saying Nana wasn't breathing.
What'd you do?
I ran into her room. I tried to look for her pulse. I tried to see if she was alive, but nothing. She was dead.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I'm very sorry for your loss. Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Rogers, you'd say you and your grandmother were pretty close growing up. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes, we were.
Like you said, the two of you played backgammon together.
We did.
You cooked together from time to time while you lived with her in 2018.
Yes, I wasn't a great cook, but she taught me a lot.
And the two of you spent a lot of time together. Isn't that right?
Yes, until I lost my parents, yes.
I want to flash back to when you lost your parents in 2008. Now, in 2008, Miss Lee named you the sole inheritor of her estate. Isn't that right?
Yes,
And in 2008, you were a junior in college.
I was.
You and your grandmother communicated frequently.
That's right.
You two saw each other frequently as well, right?
Before I lost my parents, yes.
That's right. And then, as you said, in July of 2008, your parents passed away.
Yeah, it was July 4th. They were driving back to see me. I lost them on the I-94.
Now, your parents, they left you a trust fund. Isn't that right?
They did.
They left you a trust fund of about $2 million.
Objection, Your Honor, to relevance. Whether or not Mr. Rogers' parents left him a trust fund with a value of $2 million makes no fact in today's case more or less likely and is thus irrelevant.
Response, Your Honor? Your Honor, this goes directly towards Mr. Rogers' motive for showing back up at Miss Lee's home in July of 2018. It's highly probative for the jury to hear the amount because we'll see how that $2 million was eventually run out, and thus was the cause of Mr. Rogers moving back in with Agatha Lee in 2018.
A response, Your Honor? Coming back to visit your grandmother and to stay with her isn't a crime. Mr. Rogers doesn't need a particular motive, as counsel just said, to come back and visit his grandmother. Moreover, Your Honor, I believe it's the defendant's contention in today's case that Miss Lee killed herself. And so whether or not Mr. Rogers needed money from his grandmother doesn't make any fact in today's case more or less likely.
Response on those grounds, Your Honor?
Yes, and then I'll roll.
Yes, Your Honor. This is also being used to rebut the fact that Mr. Rogers was physically close with Miss Lee in terms of familiar relationship. We've already heard a lot of evidence that the two were close. They spent a lot of time together. But as we'll see, when the trust fund ran out of money, Mr. Rogers moved back in, and it throws into contention the actual reasons behind Mr. Rogers moving back in with Miss Lee.
Well, I'm going to allow it for two reasons. One, because a witness's credibility or potential bias is always relevant. And two, although the defendant didn't articulate the specific reason, I would guess that the defense may later challenge Mr. Rogers' testimony about whether or not Ms. Mars actually did put those pills in the pill case. And so if he had a motive for coming back, if he had a motive for shading his testimony one way or the other today, that would certainly, or this testimony would certainly be relevant to that.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Rogers, as I asked, your parents left you a trust fund of $2 million when they passed, correct?
They did.
And about a month after your parents passed, in August of 2008, your grandmother named you as the sole inheritor of her estate, right?
Yes.
Now, I want to talk about your life after your grandmother left you as the sole inheritor of her estate. Let's flash forward to 2011. In 2011, you had decided to take a leave of absence from law school.
That's right.
And in 2011, you weren't communicating as regularly with your grandmother, were you?
Yes.
You weren't seeing Miss Lee as frequently as you were in 2008, right?
That's right.
And in 2008, or excuse me, in 2011, between 2011 and 2018, when you moved back in, you didn't see your grandmother once, did you?
Physically, no.
And between 2011 and 2018, when you moved back in with Miss Lee, you talked on the phone with her on one occasion. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Now, Miss Lee, she tried to contact you, didn't she?
I don't know.
Well, you know that she tried to call you on the phone over the course of those 7 years, right?
I don't.
Well, Mr. Rogers, you know that your grandmother wrote you letters, isn't that right?
Yes, I know that she did, yes.
And you'd recognize one of those letters if I were to show it to you?
I would.
Now, Your Honor, let the record reflect I'm showing opposing counsel and this witness what's been pre-marked as Exhibit 10. Now, Mr. Rogers, this is one of the letters that your grandmother sent you, right?
Yes, it looks like it.
That's a fair and accurate copy.
Yes.
It hasn't been changed or altered in any way.
No, it's her handwriting.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense moves to enter Exhibit 10 into evidence.
Any objections?
Yes, Your Honor. Objection to hearsay. These are out-of-court statements being offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted therein and are thus inadmissible.
Okay. Mr. Richardson, your response?
Yes, Your Honor. Pursuant to 803.15, the statements enclosed in this letter affect an interest in property. If I may proffer, this letter explains that Miss Lee was changing who would become the inheritor of her estate when she would pass, and therefore directly affecting that interest in property. Furthermore, Your Honor, under 803.3, there are statements about the motive or intent behind changing who would become the sole inheritor of the estate, and therefore, under 803.3, those statements would be covered as well. As for statements of family relationship, pursuant to 804B4, Ms. Lee is unfortunately unavailable as a witness today, so her statements would qualify under the exception of statements made concerning familial history. So pursuant to those three exceptions, Your Honor, this statement clears the bar for hearsay.
All right, Ms.
Response,
Hill,
Your Honor?
there's obviously a lot to unpack there. Take it in whichever order you'd like.
Yes, Your Honor. Responding to 803.3 and 803.15, I'd agree with counsel that the second to last paragraph in this document does contain statements that affect an interest in property and that are statements of a plan or an intent. In particular, because we've become family in name only, I've decided to change my will. And just as soon as I sign this letter, I'm going to sign a new will leaving everything to Drew. And so I'd be amenable to a constructive redaction of this document to contain only that second to last paragraph, as those are the only statements that are actually statements of a motive, intent, or plan.
Response on those grounds, Your Honor.
Certainly.
Your Honor, paragraphs 2 and 3 actually also go to 803.3. They're stating the reasons, further reasoning why Miss Lee has decided to change her will. The statement, "You never visit and I don't hear for you months at a stretch, and I don't even remember the last time you called or wrote without asking for money." That's a statement directly out of paragraph 3. And the very next paragraph, which opposing counsel has already stated they have no problem with, elicits that fact. Because we've become family in name only, essentially reiterating the facts in the previous two paragraphs, she's changing who is going to become the sole inheritor of the estate. So for those reasons, the second and third paragraphs also clear the bar for under 803.3.
A response, Your Honor?
Yes.
The statements contained in the second and third paragraphs are not covered by Rule 803.3 because they are not statements themselves of a plan, intent, or motive. They need to be statements individually that go to the declarant's plan, intent, or motive. Furthermore, the exception to the rule against hearsay 804B4, statements of personal or family history, does not govern these statements. Statements that are governed by that exception are about the declarant's own birth, adoption, legitimacy, marriage, divorce, relationship by blood. Descriptive statements describing the nature or quality of a relationship are not governed by that exception. And so the only statements that are admissible pursuant to an exception against the rule against hearsay would be the second to last paragraph.
Any response to that, Mr. Richardson?
Yes, Your Honor. I would reiterate that at the very first sentence in the, I believe, fourth paragraph, it says, because we've become family in name only. And if you'll look back through it at paragraphs 2 and 3, Ms. Lee is reiterating the reasons why they have become family in name only. And therefore, it is the motive, and it does go towards the intent of Ms. Lee to change the inheritor of her will.
All right. I'll start with 804. Ms. Hill, I agree with you. I think you're right that 804 is, or at least the particular exception, is narrower than what we're looking at here in this letter. So I don't think the letter is admissible on those grounds. Regarding 803.3 and 803.15, it's been a while since I've dealt with 803.15, and it may only deal with documents that affect an interest in property directly, like a contract or a will itself. But I'm not certain of that, and because the parties seem at least to be agreed on paragraph 4, I'm certainly happy to admit that under 803.15 and 803.3. I also agree that the contents of that paragraph qualify under 803.3, but I do think the background does not. 803.3 talks about the facts that underlie, or the statements of memory or belief to prove a fact remembered, for instance, not being admissible. So I think that paragraph is all that would come in under those hearsay exceptions. Mr. Richardson, do you have any other arguments other than the hearsay exceptions why this document should be admitted?
No, Your Honor, we just simply reiterate the fact that those statements, because we become family in name only, if you do find, and it sounds like you have, that those do qualify under the 803.3 exception, the things that she's explaining why they become family in name only in the paragraphs preceding, we believe we stand by the fact that they are 803.3, and they give more explanation as to that first sentence, but that's where we are.
Okay. I'll admit Exhibit 10 with redactions or constructive redactions on paragraphs 1, 2, 3, and 5, leaving the caption, the signature, and paragraph 4.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Mr. Rogers, this is the letter that your grandmother sent informing you that she was changing her will, right?
That's what she told me, yes.
And in this letter, it explains why she was changing her will, right?
Yes.
It says, because we've become family in name only, right?
That's what she said, yeah.
If my co-counsel could take down the exhibit now, thank you. Now, Mr. Rogers, I want to be clear. In February of 2018, when you got that letter, you didn't rush to your grandmother's house to rekindle your relationship.
No.
Well, you still had money in that trust fund that your parents left you. Isn't that right?
That wasn't the reason I didn't rush back, no.
Well, Mr. Rogers, that wasn't the question I asked. I asked if you still had money in your parents' trust fund in February of 2018. And the answer to that question is yes, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, in June of 2018, a few months later, you did try to rekindle your relationship with your grandmother, right?
I did.
And to be clear, in that same month, June 2018, your parents' trust fund ran out, didn't it?
That same month, yes, but I still had a lot of money with me.
To be clear, you had $12,000 in cash at that time, right?
Yes, and around $500,000 in property.
Now, Mr. Rogers, when you first tried to seek out your grandmother, you didn't go to Midlands, did you?
No, I went to Alabama where her house used to be.
That's right, you thought she was still living in Alabama.
I did.
You didn't know where she had moved to.
No.
So you hired an investigator to find your grandmother.
I did.
You paid an investigator $10,000 to find your grandmother, right?
Yes, I really wanted to see her.
And to be clear, that investigator, that's Miss Madeline Bond, right?
Yes, that's Madeline.
And she's testifying for you today?
That's what I've heard, yes.
Eventually, Madeline Bond was able to track down your grandmother, right?
Yes, a day later. That's why I knew she was the best. So I paid her $10,000.
And so you showed up at your grandmother's house in Midlands, correct?
I did.
Now, on direct examination, you said that you weren't sure how long you were going to stay, but it's true that you showed up on the front door with your suitcases, isn't it?
Yes.
And when you first moved in with your grandmother, that's when you met Drew Mars, right?
Yes.
You knew Drew Mars was your grandmother's caretaker.
I did.
You knew Drew Mars had cared for your grandmother for 10 years.
Yes.
In fact, your grandmother had told you that through thick and thin, Drew Mars had stayed with her, right?
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay to the statements of the grandmother, unless they're coming directly from the document in question.
Yeah. Yes, Your Honor, they are actually coming out of Exhibit 25 from the paragraph that you admitted.
I'll withdraw my objection, Your Honor.
I thought it was Exhibit 10 that I ruled on.
Exhibit 10. Yes, Your Honor, my misspeak.
Okay, but
Yes, Your Honor.
they're coming from that paragraph.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, great.
And if my co-counsel pull up Exhibit 10, it might be easier for us to see. So in that fifth paragraph there, it says that Drew Mars had stayed with your grandmother through thick and thin. Is that right, Mr. Rogers?
Yes, that was before I moved in, yes.
And that Drew Mars had turned down more money with more lucrative patients, correct?
That's what Nana said.
And your grandmother said that for a decade, Drew Mars had stayed with her.
Yes.
Thank you. My co-counsel can take down the exhibit. Now, it's your contention today, Mr. Rogers, that after living with your grandmother for just over a month, she decided to change all of that, right?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
It's your contention today, Mr. Rogers, that after living with your grandmother for just over a month, your grandmother decided to change her entire will, right?
Yes. She was happy I visited, that we reconnected, and that's what she told me.
Let's talk about the meeting where you claim that she informed you about changing her will. That was on August 14th, correct?
Yes, it was early that morning.
Mr. Rogers, I'd like for you to paint us a picture of that conversation. You're in your grandmother's study, correct?
Yes.
There aren't any attorneys present.
No, sir.
There weren't any witnesses to sign any legal documents present.
No.
It was just you and Agatha Lee in that room, right?
It was just Nana and myself, yes.
And Agatha Lee certainly hadn't already written up a will, right?
I don't know.
But from what you know, your grandmother didn't show you any new will during that meeting?
No, she told me she was going to call her lawyers.
Now, let's flash forward a little bit. You're familiar with an individual named Ryan Cabrera, right?
Yes.
Mr. Cabrera is an author.
Yes.
Mr. Cabrera was given permission by your grandmother to write her biography. Is that right?
Yes.
And Mr. Rogers, this was pretty unusual, wasn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, your grandmother had never given any other author permission to write her biography before.
I'm not sure.
From what you know, she had never given permission, right?
Yes.
Yes, she had never given anyone permission to write her biography before?
Sir, I don't know who she gave permission or not permission to, excuse me.
But Miss Lee never informed you that she had given anyone else permission to write her biography, correct?
No, she didn't tell me.
Oh. You know that your grandmother her health was on the decline right before she died, right?
No, sir. I was with her that morning. She was fine. I mean, she was glowing.
Mr. Rogers, would it surprise you to hear that that author, Ryan Cabrera, did notice her health decline on that very same day?
I don't know, but I was with her that morning and she was glowing. She would have a grapefruit every morning. She said it made her feel great. She was great that morning.
But that's drawing you back to my question. It would surprise you then if Ryan Cabrera, who saw your grandmother on that same day, did notice that her health and her demeanor was different.
Yes.
Now, you hired an investigator after your grandmother passed away, correct?
Yes, sir.
You hired that same investigator that actually found your grandmother.
Yes, I hired Madeline because I didn't trust the police.
That's right. You didn't trust the police to get that investigation right.
That's right. I don't trust the police.
And you did trust Madeline Bond to get that investigation right, didn't you?
I trusted her to run an objective investigation.
To get the investigation right, Mr. Rogers, isn't that correct?
Yes.
In fact, you paid Madeline Bond $25,000 to get this investigation right.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Ms. Hill, any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor, yes.
All right.
Mr. Rogers, on cross-examination, you were asked a lot of questions about the time from 2011 to 2018. Now, did you see your grandmother after 2018?
I saw her that year, yes.
When did you see her first in that year?
I saw her first on July 4th, 2018.
When was the last time that you saw your grandmother?
August 14th, the day before she died.
So for that month and a half, did you see your grandmother every day, every week? How often did you see her?
Miss Hill, I lived with her, so I saw her every day.
Can you describe for the members of the jury what you thought about her health and her demeanor in that time?
She looked pretty great to me. I mean, sure, she had crow's feet on her eyes. She was 82 years old, but she was glowing.
On August 14th of 2018, did you notice a decline in her demeanor?
No, we spent the entire afternoon watching a movie, so she looked pretty great to me.
On cross-examination, Mr. Richardson also asked you if it was just you and Agatha Lee in that room where you talked about the will. Was there anyone else around for that conversation?
Drew was standing right outside.
And when you came out of the room, did Drew say anything to you? Can you remind us?
She said, no way.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Nothing further for the witness, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Richardson, any further cross-examination based on that redirect?
No, Your Honor, nothing further.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, you're excused.
Thank you.
The plaintiff may call your next witness.
Plaintiff calls Madeline Bond to the stand. May we proceed?
You may.
Good morning. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hi, my name is Madeline Bond.
And what do you do for a living, Ms. Bond?
I'm a private investigator and consulting detective. Think Sherlock Holmes, but without the British accent.
Can you tell us a bit about your experience as a private investigator?
Sure. So I actually got into it in college. I played a detective on my college mock trial team, and I loved it so much that when I graduated, I went on to get licensed as a private investigator in Midlands. Over the past decade, I've solved countless cases. You might have even read about some of them in the news.
And what's your connection to today's case?
I was retained by Stevie Rogers to investigate the death of his grandmother, Agatha Lee. the famous mystery novelist and millionaire.
In the interest of full disclosure, Ms. Bond, are you being compensated today?
Yes, I'm being compensated my standard rate for my work in this case.
I want to talk about how you got involved in today's case. When did Mr. Rogers first retain you to investigate his grandmother's death?
That was August 15th, 2018.
Was that the first time Mr. Rogers had contacted you?
No, it wasn't. He had first reached out to me in June of that same year to find out where his grandmother was living.
Did you find his grandmother?
Yes, she was living at her manor in Midlands.
Your Honor, at this time, let the record reflect that Ms. Hill is displaying a timeline of events to the members of the jury, constructively outside the view of Ms. Bond. Ms. Bond, have you ever been to Miss Lee's manor?
Yes, I went there for the first time in August of 2018.
Why did you go in August?
On the morning of August 15th, Stevie Rogers called me and told me that his grandmother had passed away. I immediately went to the house to investigate what had happened.
What did you do when you got to the house?
I went up to the second floor bedroom. That's where I found Agatha Lee in her bed.
Was there anyone else in the room?
Yes, Stevie Rogers and Drew Mars were both present.
And who is Drew Mars?
Drew Mars was Miss Lee's caretaker. I learned during my investigation that she had been Miss Lee's caretaker since 2008 and that she lived with her full time.
So what happened when you got to that second floor bedroom with Mr. Rogers and Miss Mars?
So shortly after I arrived, the local detective got there and we both began our investigations. I learned that on the night of Miss Lee's death, the only people in the house were Agatha Lee, Stevie Rogers, and Drew Mars.
Okay, let's walk through your investigation into the death of Mr. Rogers' grandmother. How'd you begin?
Well, first I had to figure out the cause of death. There weren't any physical signs of trauma, but naturally I needed to do an autopsy to figure out how Miss Lee had died. After I sent the body over to the medical examiners, I took the opportunity to speak with Miss Mars.
Did you learn anything from that conversation?
Yes. So because Miss Mars was Miss Lee's caretaker, I asked her about Miss Lee's health. Miss Mars told me that she had been in very good health leading up to the incident. Miss Mars did tell me that Miss Lee took several medications daily, one of which was for arthritis. And she told me that Miss Lee had a fatal allergy to a drug called chloroandramine, which is sold over the counter.
What did you do after that conversation?
Oh, I asked Ms. Mars if I could search her room.
How did Miss Mars respond?
She refused to cooperate.
What do you mean?
She wouldn't let me search her room. At that point, we hadn't yet secured a warrant, so there wasn't much more I could do. I left for the day.
Did you go back to Miss Lee's residence after August 15th?
Yes, I did. We were called back to the residence on August 20th for the reading of Miss Lee's will.
Your Honor, we'll be displaying what has been previously marked as Exhibit 9 constructively outside the view of the jury.
All right.
What is this, Miss Bond?
This is Miss Lee's will, dated February of 2018.
It's a fair and accurate copy?
Yes, it is.
At this time, plaintiff moves Exhibit 9 into evidence.
Without objection, Your Honor.
All right. Exhibit 9 is received.
Miss Bond, what happened at the reading of the will?
The lawyer announced that Ms. Lee had left everything she owned to Drew Mars.
How did Drew Mars respond when she heard that?
She acted shocked. She kept repeating, "I can't believe it. I had no idea," which I found to be a little suspicious.
Why did you find that to be suspicious?
Because I knew it was a lie.
How did you know that was a lie?
Because of an email I found on August 15th.
Your Honor will be displaying what has previously been marked as Exhibit 13, once again constructively outside the view of the jury. What are we looking at here, Miss Bond?
This is a photograph of that email. I found it on Drew Marr's laptop.
Does this photograph fairly and accurately represent that email?
Yes, it does.
Plaintiff moves Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Any objection from the defense?
Without objection, Your Honor.
All right. Exhibit 13 is received.
Why was this email significant, Ms. Bond?
Well, in this email, Ms. Mars wrote that Miss Lee had just changed her will to leave everything to her.
When was this email dated?
February 1st, 2018.
And when was the reading of the will?
August 20th, 2018. In other words, Ms. Mars had known about this will for 7 months.
What happened after you discovered the defendant had lied?
After that, the state's detective agreed to order the autopsy and toxicology report after all.
Did you get the results of those reports?
Yes, I did.
Ms. Hill, if you could please pull up Exhibit 2, which has been pre-admitted into evidence. What are we looking at here, Ms. Bond?
This is that autopsy report I mentioned.
And what did this report tell you about how Miss Lee died?
The chief medical examiner concluded to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that Miss Lee died due to a fatal allergic reaction to chloroandramine. That's the same drug that Ms. Mars had mentioned to me earlier. So at that point, it became my job to figure out why Miss Lee had ingested this drug that she was fatally allergic to.
How'd you begin figuring that out?
Well, I took a look at the medications she took regularly to see if there were any clues as to how chloroandramine made it into her pill box.
What did you find?
I found that Ms. Lee regularly took an arthritis medication that was identical in shape, size, and color to chloroandramine. So it was possible that someone switched out Miss Lee's pills without her ever realizing.
At that point, did you have any suspects for who could have switched those pills?
Yes. Drew Mars had told me that as her caretaker, she regularly handled Miss Lee's medications.
Did you find any other evidence to support that suspicion?
Yes, I did. On August 14th, the day before Miss Lee died, I found out that Drew Mars had visited a pharmacy.
Do you know if the defendant purchased chloroandramine at that pharmacy?
I can't be sure. Drew Mars didn't provide us with a receipt, but I know chloroandramine is regularly sold over the counter.
Well, did you ever find chloroandramine in the defendant's possession?
Yes, I did. About a week after the initial investigation, when we searched Miss Mars' room with a warrant, we found a bag containing chloroandramine in Miss Mars' closet.
Ms. Bond, do you recognize this photograph? One moment. This photograph?
Yes, I do. This is that bag we found.
Does this accurately represent the bag as you last saw it?
Yes, it does.
At this time, plaintiff moves Exhibit 15 into evidence.
Counsel, any objection to Exhibit 15?
Without objection, Your Honor.
All right. Exhibit 15 is received.
Aside from being found in the defendant's closet, was there anything else to tie this bag to her?
Yes. The police conducted a fingerprint analysis on the bag after it was found. There was a partial print on the zipper.
Who did that partial print belong to?
It was a 16-point match to Drew Mars.
During the course of your investigation, Ms. Bond, did you find the drug that killed Agatha Lee in anyone else's possession?
No, only Drew Mars.
Do you know if anyone else lied to you?
No, as far as I know, it was just Drew Mars.
And Ms. Bond, as far as you know, did anyone else stand to inherit $20 million as a result of Miss Lee's death?
No. The only person named in Miss Lee's will was Drew Mars.
Thank you, Ms. Bond. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, counsel. Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Miss Bond, you would agree with me that you're hired by the plaintiff in today's case, Mr. Stevie Rogers.
Yes, I was.
But that's not the first time that the plaintiff has required your services, is it?
No. In June of 2018, Mr. Rogers hired me to find out where his grandmother was living.
That's right. And you took that case up.
Yes, I did.
And you found out that Miss Agatha Lee was just living at her house.
She was living at her manor in Midlands. She'd previously been living in Alabama, so she had moved since the last time she'd been in touch with Stevie Rogers.
And to be clear, that job wasn't very difficult for you, was it?
Not for someone as experienced as me, but I did have to go to some lengths to figure it out. She had actually purchased that property under a holding company named after one of the characters of her book. She wasn't just in the phone book, and her address wasn't listed publicly.
Well, Miss Bond, you were able to find out exactly where she was in less than a day.
Yes, that's correct. I'm very
And you were able to tell Stevie Rogers, the plaintiff, exactly where her grandmother was in under 24 hours.
Yes, that's right.
Now, to be clear, for that job that took you less than 24 hours, the plaintiff paid you $10,000.
That's right, my standard rate.
And in today's case, the plaintiff has promised to pay you $25,000.
That's right. The more difficult a case is, the more my standard rate is. For a murder investigation, it's a little higher than simply looking up someone's location.
And to be clear, the plaintiff promised to pay you. He didn't pay you in advance.
No, that's right.
And you were aware of the fact from talking with Mr. Stevie Rogers that he was looking to inherit $20 million.
Well, his name wasn't in the will, no, but this lawsuit, yes, is over Miss Lee's inheritance.
That's right. And you know that if the plaintiff is successful in today's case, Mr. Stevie Rogers will inherit $20 million.
Yes, that's, I believe, what will happen.
And if this case is successful, then Mr. Rogers, he'll be able to pay you the $25,000 that you asked from him.
Well, Mr. Rogers assured me that he already has that money. Since his grandmother passed away, he's been working some odd jobs, and he told me that he'd make sure I got the money.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the conclusions that you made about what happened on August 18th.
Of course.
You would agree with me that you thought that Miss Drew Mars, well, you thought that she knew that the will would one day not belong to her. Isn't that right?
No. Oh, yes. Mr. Rogers did say that Drew Mars overheard that conversation. Drew Mars didn't tell me that herself.
That's right. You learned this only from talking with the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers.
Yes, Mr. Rogers relayed that information to me.
Now, you talked to Drew Mars, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
But you never mentioned or asked Miss Mars about who the will or who she thought the will was going to.
Well, when I first spoke to Drew Mars, it was actually just to figure out what had happened in the first place. I asked her about Miss Lee's health, the medications she took regularly. At that point, she wasn't yet a suspect.
Well, Miss Bond, I'm not asking about this specific conversation. I'm talking about in the entire course of your investigation, you never thought to ask Miss Mars what she thought or where she thought the will was going to go to, did you?
No, I didn't. I just had that email from her from February of that year.
And that email, to be clear, said that Miss Mars was going to inherit everything.
That's right.
Now, you also spoke with Mr. Ryan Cabrera, isn't that right?
Yes, I did.
You never asked Mr. Cabrera, the person who was intimately familiar with Miss Lee, you never asked him either who was going to get that will.
Attorney testifying to the relationship of Ryan Cabrera and Agatha Lee.
Counsel, can you rephrase your question?
Yes, I can rephrase. Miss Bond, you never asked Mr. Cabrera what he knew about where that will was going, did you?
No, Mr. Cabrera was never a suspect and wasn't related to Miss Lee and was never named in her wills, to the best of my knowledge. So I didn't ask him to clarify that.
I'm not asking about whether or not you thought Mr. Cabrera was a suspect, but in your investigation, you figured out that Mr. Cabrera spent a lot of time with Miss Lee, right?
Yes, I found out that he was writing a book about her.
That's right. And that Mr. Cabrera knew a lot about the personal life of Miss Lee.
Well, I can't tell you exactly what Mr. Cabrera knew. That's why I asked Stevie Rogers and Drew Mars. They both lived with Ms. Lee full time and had a closer personal relationship as far as I was aware.
That's right, Ms. Bond. So the only person that you asked about the will was the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers.
Stevie Rogers told me about the will, yes.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things that we can agree on happened on August 14th.
Sure.
You would agree with me that the person who was responsible for the death of Miss Lee, well, they would need access to her medication.
Yes, of course.
You would agree with me that Agatha Lee has access to her own medication.
Yes, I believe so.
We can agree that the person who is responsible for the death of Miss Lee, they'd have to know that she's allergic to chloroandramine, wouldn't they?
Yes, I believe so.
And you'd agree with me that Miss Agatha Lee, well, she knows about her own allergy, right?
I assume she does. I didn't find any specific statements clarifying that, but I would assume she knows about her own allergy, yes.
Now, we can also agree that someone would have to have time alone to switch that medication, isn't that right?
Yes, most likely.
No, you remember speaking with Miss Drew Mars.
Yes, I spoke with Drew Mars.
And you remember Miss Mars telling you that people spent a lot of time, or Miss Lee spent a lot of time by herself on August 14th. Isn't that right?
Yes, I believe in the evening.
Now, another thing Miss Mars told you is that on the days leading up to her death, Miss Lee seemed kind of lethargic.
She did mention that, but she said that Miss Lee was in very good health at the time.
So that's a yes. She did tell you that in the days leading up to her death, Miss Lee looked lethargic.
Sure.
And she looked downtrodden in the days leading up to her death.
Yes, I
Your
suppose.
Honor, to hearsay statements of Drew Mars.
Thoughts?
Yes, Your Honor. May I respond?
Yes, please.
These fall under Rule 8033, specifically the emotional state of Miss Mars. And actually, well, never mind, Your Honor. We're not asking for any specific statements that Drew Mars told her. Or I guess, yes, we are. Sorry about that, Your Honor. Yeah, these go towards statements of Miss Mars' belief that she was concerned for her health. And these statements affected the listener. Therefore, they're not hearsay.
So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions.
Yes, Your Honor.
From plaintiff's counsel. What do you mean these statements affected the listener?
Yes, Your Honor. The statements by Drew Mars affected the conclusions from Miss Bond as to the health of Miss Agatha Lee.
Okay. And then you said that these statements reflected Mr. Mars, Ms. Mars' belief or
her emotional state, Your Honor, if I may proffer on that.
Sure.
The very next question I was going to ask Miss Bond was whether or not Miss Mars told Miss Bond that she was concerned for the health of Agatha Lee.
Okay. Response, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. First of all, under Midland's Rules of Evidence 8033, for something to qualify as an exception to the rule against hearsay, it must be a statement of a then existing mental, emotional, or physical condition. If Drew Mars was saying, for example, I feel lethargic personally, that might fall under that exception. But for Drew Mars to speak about Agatha Lee's then existing mental, physical, or emotional condition, that doesn't fall under that exception.
I believe you're right. And just so I make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, counsel, is it Guillaume?
Guillaume.
Guillaume. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Guillaume. Mr. Baruki, I think that plaintiff's counsel is right about that point. This is not Ms. Mars speaking about her own health or her own well-being or her own plan, that she's relaying someone else's. Can you explain to me more about how these statements relate to Ms. Bond's conclusions?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Bond, in her investigative report, ruled out the possibility of suicide. And this is evidence that Ms. Bond used, or rather ignored, in coming to those conclusions and ruling out suicide.
And Mr. Guillaume, what is your response to that?
They're absolutely using these statements for the truth of the matter asserted, regardless of the effect on Ms. Bond's investigation. They've repeatedly made the point that Miss Agatha Lee was feeling downtrodden or lethargic in the days leading up to her death. And that's a central piece of their theory in today's case. They're very clearly using that for the truth of the matter asserted.
I think that's right, based on what I've heard. Your objection sustained.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Ms. Bond, you were familiar with Miss Agatha Lee from before the plaintiff hired you, isn't that right?
Yes, from her work.
That's right. You read Death of a Bottle.
Yes, I did. It was a great book.
And when you took on this case, you quickly realized that there were some similarities between that book and what was happening on August 14th.
Yes, well, it seemed like Agatha Lee had used her own allergy as the murder weapon in the book. So really life mimics art.
That's right, Miss Bond. You learned that in this case, Miss Agatha Lee died in the same way that she did in her one and only work. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Nothing further.
Any redirect examination?
No redirect, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Bond. You may step down.
Your Honor, I didn't hear you there.
Become choppy.
Apologies, Judge Romano. I'm also having a little bit of difficulty hearing you right there. Will you repeat yourself again?
Certainly. I was asking if there was anything further from the plaintiff, and I noticed that my internet connection may have become a little choppy, but I think I'm back now.
Nothing further from the plaintiff, Your Honor.
Okay. At this time, does the plaintiff rest?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. How are we doing on our overall time? I forgot to check to see what time all loss was going to be.
We can look into that.
So our round started at 10:46 this morning. So all loss will be at 12:01 p.m.
What time zone?
It's currently 12. Sorry, I am in the wrong time zone. It is our all loss is at 1:01 p.m.
Well, 1:01 p.m. is what I have right now.
Sorry, 1:01 Central Time. I am in Central Time. You are in Eastern. So 2:01 p.m. Eastern.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you think we have time for, given how much time the parties have used so far, for a 10-minute break?
I think that's that at this point, that's up to the parties themselves. Plaintiff, defense, do you want to weigh in on whether a 5 or a 10-minute break is the most sense, given that we have less than an hour now until all loss?
Given that we only have an hour, perhaps a 5-minute break is a bit more responsible.
Okay, that's fine. We'll take a 5-minute break. I had heard that some of the members of the public observing the trial were not able to hear me, and I was hoping to maybe try to play with my equipment a little over the break, but as we're running close on time, I will save that for after the trial is concluded.
Yes, Your Honor.
Sounds good. As a reminder, everybody is still on a live stream. So do not forget that. You can have your video and your audio muted, and I will send the students to a breakout room. In 4 minutes, you'll get the warning that you'll come back into this main room in 60 seconds, and then we'll get started.
Thank you.
Judges, I've gone ahead and closed the breakout rooms for the competitors, so they're going to begin to join this main room again. Judges, if you could each turn your video on or send me a direct message now to confirm that you are back and sitting in front of your computer. Once everyone has done that, we will go ahead and get started. David Hill, thank you. Anna, thank you. Okay, and then I've got Will, Elliot, Alex, and Daniel. Okay. Believe we are all back and running. We can go ahead and begin the next half of the trial.
All right. Thank you very much. We're ready to resume the trial, and just bear with me for a moment. Everyone is back and ready to go. If there are no other preliminary matters, we'll hear from the defense, and you may call your first witness.
At this time, the defense calls Ms. Drew Mars to the stand. May I proceed?
You may. I'd like to also remind plaintiff's counsel who will be dealing with the cross-examination to please activate their video feed. Yes. Okay. We're ready.
Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hi, my name is Drew Mars.
And can you tell the jury a little bit about yourself?
Well, I come from a pretty big Indian family. My parents immigrated to the United States when I was pretty young so that me and my siblings could have a better life here.
What do you do for a living?
Well, my family always wanted me to be a doctor, but I found that really impersonable. So I decided to go into nursing instead. And it was from nursing school that I actually became a living caretaker.
And who did you take care of as a live-in caretaker?
For a while, my patient was Agatha Lee. She was technically my patient, but she really became my family as well. Being so far from my grandparents, I came to see Agatha as a second grandmother to me.
Well, what kinds of things did you do for her as her caretaker?
Agatha was a really strong woman, and she didn't need me to do much for her. My job was just to make her life a little easier. So I'd monitor her vitals every day. I'd help arrange her medications with her in the morning. And just all around, I wanted to make sure she stayed happy and healthy.
When did you start working for Miss Lee?
It was when I was in college around 2008.
Now, are you familiar with the plaintiff in today's case, Mr. Stevie Rogers?
Yeah, he was Agatha Lee's grandson.
Were you aware of how Miss Lee felt towards her grandson at that time?
When I first started to work for Agatha, she wasn't really close to a lot of her family members. Stevie was probably the one member of her family that she really bonded with and felt close to. That changed, however, later that year.
Did something happen?
In 2008, Agatha's daughter passed away in a car accident, and Agatha was devastated. She went for weeks on end without speaking or really even leaving her bedroom. And it was at that point that her only other family, Stevie, stopped talking to her entirely.
Now, did this affect Miss Lee at all?
Yeah, I think losing Stevie made her daughter's death that much worse. She seemed to get more and more withdrawn. She actually reached out to Stevie on many occasions, and from what I can tell, he never responded. I was really concerned about her.
Now, did you ever notice Agatha improve?
Well, she talked to me about her condition, and it seemed like she was starting to feel better. It was actually around when Stevie reached out to her again. He showed up and he asked to stay with her out of nowhere. I was actually really happy. She seemed hopeful, and I was elated to see her smiling again and moving around the house. It didn't last long, though.
Well, what happened?
Well, as Stevie stayed at the house longer and longer, I could see Agatha was beginning to become more worn down again. She seemed to be distancing herself just like before Stevie returned. And then it got a lot worse on August 14th.
What happened on August 14th?
Well, I was on my way to bring Agatha's tea, and I overheard a conversation between Agatha and Stevie regarding Agatha's will.
Oh, what'd you hear?
Stevie said, "I really hope you'd reconsider cutting me out of the will." But Agatha told him no, and she sounded really upset about the whole conversation.
Now, to be clear for the jury, when did you overhear this conversation between Miss Lee and the plaintiff?
It was the 14th of August.
And when did Miss Lee pass?
I guess she died that day on the 14th of August.
Now, were you familiar with how Miss Lee was acting after you overheard that conversation between her and the plaintiff?
She was moving pretty slow around the house, and she seemed to be in real low spirits.
How so?
Well, it first was odd because she told me she was going to lay down for a nap around 2 p.m. And I'm only used to her doing that on really bad days. So I came up 15 minutes later to see if she got settled and she was all right, but she wasn't in her room when I came upstairs. She was standing outside my room, not moving. I was actually worried that maybe she was getting disoriented, especially with all the changes I had noticed in her behavior. I was concerned that maybe something happened.
Were you able to see what she did after she was standing outside of your room?
Well, she was there for a bit, and then I watched her walk into her room, and she locked the door behind her.
Is it normal for her to lock the door behind her?
No, almost never. I can't remember the last time she's done that. And with how odd she was acting, I thought it could be really dangerous in case she needed help, and I wouldn't be able to help her at that point.
Now, was that the last time that you saw Miss Agatha Lee?
No, later that night she came down, and out of nowhere, she asked me to cook one of her favorite meals. It was figs and orange scones with clotted cream. I can't remember the last time. It's probably been a year since she's asked me to cook it.
Did you make that special request for her?
Yeah, I figured maybe she just wanted something to kind of raise her spirits. But when I headed up to tell her dinner was ready, it seemed like there was much more to it than that.
How so?
When I came up, Agatha was just sitting in her bed and staring lifelessly at the wall. Her face was puffy, she was sniffling, and there was a box of tissues next to her bed. I would have told you she'd probably been crying for a while. It was the saddest I'd ever seen her.
After you saw Miss Lee with what looked like she was crying, what did you do next?
Well, I gently offered that dinner was ready to see if maybe we could sit down and have dinner together. I hope maybe I could cheer her up because sometimes we'd get meals, and when we did, I usually could get her to laugh. But she said she wanted to have dinner in her study.
Now, was this the last time that you saw Miss Lee?
Yeah, I guess that was the last time I saw her alive.
I'd like to talk about the next day. Were you in the house at that time?
Yeah, I actually was the one to find her in bed that morning.
And can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
I mean, I just went to check on her to see what she wanted for breakfast. And when I came in, she was lifeless. I couldn't believe she was gone.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this point, I have no further questions.
All right. Thank you very much. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Mars, you want us to believe you didn't kill Mr. Rogers' grandmother, right?
I would have never killed Agatha. I was so far from my family, and I get homesick all the time. And so being with her every day, I felt like she was my family here. And I would never have done anything to hurt her.
Miss Mars, you want us to believe that you're telling the truth.
I am telling the truth, yes.
But you've lied before.
What do you mean?
I mean, you've lied in the past, right?
About what?
Well, specifically, on August 20th, you were in the room when Miss Lee's will was read out loud.
Yeah, I was. I was there that day. It was awful.
It was announced that you would inherit Miss Lee's entire estate.
Yeah.
You said multiple times, "I can't believe it."
I know. I was horrified. That day was horrifying. Stevie had accused me of murder multiple times to my face. He hired some strange investigator to start poking around in my things. I felt like I was being attacked, and I just lost my grandmother of sorts. And so I acted surprised because I wanted to leave. I wanted the whole situation to be done, and I wanted to go home and away from all these people.
Miss Mars, if you could just keep it to a yes or no, I'd really appreciate that.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I did act surprised that day.
Specifically, you said multiple times, "I can't believe it."
I did, yes.
You said multiple times, "I had no idea."
Yeah, I did.
But that was a lie.
I was aware of the contents of Agatha's will from a while ago. She had mentioned to me that she was going to leave me her estate, which was way too much. It was so kind and it was a lot. So I did know about her will. I felt so persecuted in that room that I thought that was my best method of just leaving the situation entirely.
Like you just said, Miss Mars, you knew about that will on August 20th?
Yes, I did.
You knew about it before Miss Lee died?
I did know about it.
You knew for months that if Miss Lee died, you would collect her inheritance.
Yes, and that was a really large gift for her to give me, especially with her. She paid me a great salary. I wanted for nothing when I worked for her. I never had issues with money, and so for her to offer me that too was incredibly large.
Miss Mars, once again, if you could just keep it to a yes or no, if that's possible.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Now, I want to talk about that will. Miss Hill, if you could please pull up Exhibit 9. This is Miss Lee's will, right?
Yes, I believe so.
It names you as the inheritor of her estate,
Yes, yes,
which means that you'd get her house,
yes.
you get the proceeds of her best-selling book,
Yeah, I guess so.
you'd get her savings.
Yeah,
In other words, you knew that if Miss Lee died, you would get millions of dollars.
yeah, I guess.
Miss Mars, you needed that money.
No, Agatha paid me really well. I can't stress that enough to everyone. That was the most generous woman I had ever met.
Well, you only had a few thousand in savings.
I had a good amount in savings.
To be clear, that was just a few thousand in savings.
Okay.
That's a yes to my question. You had a few thousand in savings?
I guess it was only a few thousand. I felt like I had more than that.
You felt like you had more, but you actually had a few thousand in savings, right, Miss Mars?
Okay.
That's a yes?
Yes.
And your family back home, they didn't have a lot of money.
They're from India, and so they didn't have a lot of money where they were at.
And you've got a sibling, right?
I do. Yeah, I have a brother that I love dearly, and he's still back in India right now.
What's his name?
His name is Ravi.
And Ravi was sick, right?
Ravi's still sick. Ravi has leukemia, and I'm sorry, it's terminal, and so he's actually going to pass away. And I've known that for a while, and I've been coming to terms with it. And it's just been really hard for me and my family, as you can imagine.
Of course, Miss Morris. No, I'm sorry to ask you a few more questions about that terminal cancer, but for a while you didn't know it was terminal, right?
We've known for a good amount of time that it was terminal, years actually.
Well, before Miss Lee died, you believed you could save your brother with Miss Lee's money.
No, I did not. I know there's no way to save my brother, and I could maybe make his life a little better, which is why I send them some of my salary. But I know he's going to die, and I'd prefer not to talk more about it.
Well, Flores, I'm sorry, but just to be clear, is it your testimony that you weren't worried if Miss Lee didn't die soon, your brother might?
No, Miss Lee's death would not help my brother not die. My brother's going to die, and then I lost another family member on top of it.
Ms. Mars, you remember being interviewed by an attorney before you came to trial here today?
Yes, I do.
You swore to tell the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes,
And you recognize that if I showed it to you today?
yes, I would. Do you want me to pull it up on my end, or?
That's okay. Ms. Hill is going to share that with you.
Yeah.
This is that deposition?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. If we could go to lines 140, yeah, here we go. On 146 and 147, I want you to read along silently while I read out loud.
Of
I
course.
knew my sibling might die before Agatha passed, and I wouldn't be able to help my sibling.
Yeah,
I'm saying that.
that is what that says. I wouldn't be able to give them more money to help with his pain medication. But you misunderstand. My sibling was going to die regardless. And
Okay.
that's just a really hard thing for me and my family.
Ms. Mars, I know this is a hard subject, so we can move on.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
On August 14th, you remember overhearing a conversation with Mr. Rogers and his grandmother.
Yes, I did. I think I talked about it a little bit earlier.
Now, after that conversation, you went to a pharmacy.
Well, I took Agatha to one of her meetings with Cabrera, her biographer, and at that point I ran for groceries and I went and picked up our toiletries from CVS and her prescriptions.
So you went to a pharmacy.
Yes, sir, I did.
I want to talk about what you might have bought. You managed Miss Lee's medication before she died.
So I would pick up her prescriptions and put them in the pill organizer.
You knew she had an arthritis medication.
I did. It was winter and she took regularly for our arthritis.
And you also knew she had a deathly allergy to a drug called chloramine.
She did. It was told to me by her previous caretaker when I came on to work. Apparently, Agatha had accidentally taken some medications from someone else and it caused a severe allergic reaction.
Ms. Mars, a week after Miss Lee's death, the police searched your room.
Yeah, I guess they did.
And in your room, they found chloramine.
I see that I believe your time has expired, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense counsel, any redirect examination based on that cross?
Briefly, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Miss Mars, if you were to inherit Agatha Lee's will, would that save your brother's life?
No, he's dying as we speak, and there was nothing that can save him at this point.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Mars, you may step down.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. Defense counsel, are you ready to call your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Mr. Ryan Cabrera.
All right.
May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, my name is Ryan Cabrera.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Cabrera?
Well, I'm a biographer. I tell stories. If there's a story worth telling, I've told it. Anything from celebrities to politicians.
And why are you here today?
In 2018, I was working on a profile of Agatha Lee, the famous mystery writer, for my next book when she suddenly passed away.
What made you want to do a profile on Agatha Lee?
Well, besides my own admiration for her work, she was such a mysterious figure. I mean, she really lived as a recluse after her book was published. I reached out back in 2015 to try to do a profile, and I didn't hear anything back at first.
And did you reach back out when Miss Lee didn't respond?
No, actually, I knew she was a very private person, so I figured that it just wasn't going to happen. But then, to my surprise, 3 years later, I heard back.
I want to talk about the very first interview that you conducted with Miss Lee. Walk us through it.
Well, I was a little nervous because it wasn't quite normal. I was just given an address by her publisher and told to meet her there. But it went well. She was very nice. And then it was a little odd because she looked me dead in the eye and she said, "You can ask me any question except for one." It was kind of exciting.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay to the out-of-court statements of Miss Agatha Lee being offered here in trial for their truth.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. We're actually not using this statement that you can ask me any question except this one for the truth. Merely the subsequent action that it had on Mr. Cabrera. You're going to hear that it influenced the way Mr. Cabrera conducted the interviews, and it will actually come up later on. If I may proffer, we're going to hear that Agatha Lee allowed Mr. Cabrera to ask that question. Therefore, it would have suggested that the day in question that Ms. Lee allowed Mr. Cabrera to ask this question was different. Therefore, it goes to Mr. Cabrera's subsequent action.
So
Your Honor, if I may.
Just a moment, Ms. Hill. I notice we're not right now talking about what that question is or what she said. Ms. Hill, you might have been about to get there, but I'll hear your response.
Yes, Your Honor. I think counsel just made my point for me. The fact that Miss Lee told this witness that he wasn't allowed to ask a particular question is indeed being offered for its truth, because as Mr. Richardson just said, I believe it's the defense's contention that because eventually she did allow the question to be asked, something was different. That's truth value, and so it's inadmissible hearsay.
So I suspect we're going to get to whatever this question is down the line. When we do, Ms. Hill, do you anticipate objecting based on hearsay to it then?
To the particular question, which outside the earshot of the jury is why not write another book?
Or her answer to it?
Your Honor, I'm only objecting because I believe that the defense is going to use her answer on the day in question, August 14th, and the fact that she wouldn't allow the question to be asked before to establish that something had changed, that something was different, that Miss Lee's mindset had shifted. And so in both instances, they're using the truth of her statements to establish some kind of difference, and that's the theory of their case today, and that's why I believe it's inadmissible hearsay.
Okay. Any further response, Mr. Richardson?
Yes, Your Honor. Actually, the defense doesn't really care what this question is. In fact, it could be any question. What we're concerned about is how it affected Mr. Cabrera's outlook on the subsequent interviews with Miss Lee. As for the specifics of the question, it's of no important deal to us. Just the fact that it was off limits, and that on the day in question that it was asked, that it was a noticeable shift in Miss Lee's thinking and behavior.
If I may respond briefly, Your Honor.
No, I'll overrule the objection with a limiting instruction that the jury isn't to consider the content of this particular exchange for whatever Miss Lee might have intended, but solely for its effect on Mr. Cabrera.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Cabrera, you were telling us that there was a question that Miss Lee told you was off limits at your very first meeting. Could you tell a jury what that question was?
Yes. She said that I was never to ask why she hadn't written a second book. You know, she was such an acclaimed writer. It was obviously one of the very first things in my mind, but she said to put it on the table, so I set it aside.
I want to flash forward to your last meeting with Miss Lee. When was the last time that the two of you interviewed?
That would have been August 14th, actually, the day she died. We interviewed weekly for almost 6 months at that point.
And how did that meeting on August 14th begin?
Well, structurally, it was the same as all my others. I pulled out my tape recorder and we started talking. We were actually getting lunch that day, I believe. But her mood was totally off. It was like a whole different person.
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation to the mood of Miss Lee. That's asking the witness to testify to her state of mind and is thus speculative and inadmissible.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
My follow-up question was actually going to be how Mr. Cabrera knew that her mood was off. Furthermore, Mr. Cabrera is allowed to discuss his personal perceptions of how Ms. Lee acted. We've already heard that Mr. Cabrera conducted many interviews before this final interview. And so it would be within his knowledge to tell the jury credibly why and how Ms. Lee's attitude had changed in this last meeting.
Response, Ryan?
No, I'll overrule for now and limit this to anything that he might have observed. If it seems to me at present to be within the bounds of a lay opinion. If he crosses the line, Ms. Hill, feel free to renew your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Cabrera, you were telling us that Ms. Lee was noticeably different in this last meeting. How do you know, and what do you mean?
Well, in our meetings, Agatha normally was joking around or laughing, and she always had a smile. But this one, she was very sullen-faced. She was very reserved, was hesitant to answer questions. She just seemed distracted.
And did you ask Agatha why she was upset?
Of course, I ask Agatha everything. That's my job. I was trying to put together her whole life story.
And what did Miss Lee tell you?
She just mentioned that her grandson had asked her for something and she had to tell him no.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay within hearsay. The statements of Agatha Lee in the conversation with Mr. Cabrera are hearsay, and the related statements that she said to and from Stevie are hearsay themselves. And so this is inadmissible as hearsay within hearsay.
All right, response, Mr. Richardson?
Yes, Your Honor. Pursuant to 8033, the statements of Miss Lee saying that she felt like she had to turn down Mr. Rogers, that's a statement of emotion, of feeling. She's saying that she felt that way, that she felt like she had to turn him down. So pursuant to 8033, the statement is admissible.
Response, Your Honor?
Please.
While I don't agree with Mr. Richardson that the statement "I had to turn him down" is governed by the exception under Rule 8033, then existing mental state, which would be "I'm happy" or "I'm sad," that still doesn't address the hearsay within hearsay problem that the statement related to Mr. Cabrera is also itself hearsay being offered for its truth.
Mr. Richardson, do you have any further response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. We've already heard testimony today that there was a meeting between Miss Lee and Miss Rogers. We've heard testimony from Mr. Rogers that there was a meeting, and we've heard testimony from Drew Mars that of that same meeting. So as for that, this meeting has already sort of been discussed in court. And furthermore, I would stand by the fact that this statement that she felt like she had to turn down Mr. Rogers goes directly towards her emotional state, her feelings about this situation.
I agree with Ms. Hill. The objection is sustained. First of all, I think there's a difference between how she felt and why she felt that way. And if we allowed broadly why she felt that way, that would sort of swallow the rule. Number two, we certainly have heard a lot about this meeting, but we've heard very different perspectives. And so having a witness who corroborates one particular perspective is significant above and beyond this simply being on the record already. So objection is sustained.
Yes, Your Honor, motion to strike anything on the record from that conversation.
It will be stricken.
Now, Mr. Cabrera, I want to ask you a question about tell us how the rest of that interview went on August 14th.
It was difficult, given that she was clearly not as open and lively as usual. But I just really had a sense that this was going to be a big interview, that this was going to break open a part of the book. She pulled out a cigarette at one point and started smoking, and I knew she only, in all my time interviewing her, she had only done that when she was talking about something she was really struggling with.
Well, Mr. Cabrera, how did that meeting between you and Agatha Lee end?
Well, I stood up to go, but I noticed she was still sitting, and so I sat back down and looked at her, and she just had a tear rolling down her face, and she said, "Is there anything else you want to ask me?"
And what was she referring to?
Well, I think that she knew the only question I had left to ask was the one that was off limits. So I asked it. I said, "Why no other book?"
And was this the first time that you had asked Miss Lee that off limits question?
No, but it was the first time she had brought it up and the first time that I'd actually gotten a response.
Now, what did she tell you when you asked the question?
Well, it really broke everything open. I learned that Agatha Lee is truly the greatest American novelist since Hemingway. She had dozens of unpublished manuscripts just sitting on her shelf at home.
Now, Mr. Cabrera, did you see Miss Lee again after this interview?
No, sadly, she passed away that night. It's very ominous in light of how that final meeting went.
Objection, Your Honor, to the characterization of her final night as ominous. The witness was not present for that night and has no idea what happened.
May I respond, Your Honor? I believe Mr. Cabrera is actually referring to the meeting on August 14th, not the night. I believe his quote was that in light of that evening, their meeting that day felt ominous, and therefore it's fully within his powers to explain how that meeting felt.
I'll overrule it on that basis. I wasn't quite sure I heard it that way, but I don't want to take too much time on this given the constraints that we're under.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Cabrera, when did you find out that Miss Lee had passed away?
The next day, her housekeeper, her caretaker, called me crying and told me that Agatha had gone in her sleep.
Thank you, Mr. Cabrera. I have no further questions.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
Yes.
May I proceed?
You may.
Mr. Cabrera, I want to talk about what brings you here to trial today. Now, you know Agatha Lee was one of the most best-selling authors in Midlands.
Yes, as I said, her work was phenomenal.
Right, one of the best-selling authors in American history.
I believe so. I think that was right.
She published one book, Death in a Bottle.
Yes.
And it sold 65 million copies worldwide.
That sounds about right. I think that's it.
Published in 100 languages.
Probably. I wouldn't be surprised it's not more. Everyone should read that book.
And Mr. Cabrera, you know a little bit about publishing yourself.
Yes, I've been published 8 times for my monographs and also a few short pieces here and there.
In addition to those 8 biographies, you also published your own autobiography.
Yes, that's my most recent publication of The Career of Cabrera. It's actually in the stores now.
So to you, it was stunning that Miss Lee had never published again.
Yes, I mean, it was very surprising. You know, I understand publishing isn't everyone's game, and she was very reclusive, but someone of her talent, I couldn't believe it hadn't been utilized more.
I'll ask you to just answer yes or no to my questions, and that's a yes. You were stunned, right, Mr. Cabrera?
Yes, I was very surprised.
But while you found out that while she didn't publish another novel, she'd actually written quite a few more.
Yes, as I said, she had a number of unpublished works.
Right, you went to her study and you saw that there were a dozen unpublished works just sitting there.
Yes, on the shelf.
You were floored?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I can't imagine how good those books must be.
Right. And Mr. Cabrera, at the will reading on August 20th, you were present, right?
Yes, I was still researching at that time some background work on Agatha. I ended up not pursuing the book in her life in regards to how it ended, sadly.
So that's a yes to my question that you were present for the will reading.
I was, yes.
At that will reading, you learned that the defendant, Drew Mars, was set to inherit those unpublished works.
Yes, well, I was already aware that Agatha had named Drew, but that, yes, the books would have been going with the rest of the estate.
And the rest of the estate was going to the defendant.
Yes.
That was on August 20th of 2018.
Yep, that's correct.
But today, Mr. Cabrera, it's August 8th of 2020.
Yes, that's correct.
We're here in a civil trial.
Yes.
You understand that that means there's a question about where those books are going to go.
I'd imagine there's a question about the whole estate.
Objection, Your Honor, to an improper opinion. Mr. Cabrera is not a lawyer, has no training in the law, and so for him to, or for opposing counsel to ask him about anything that might come out of this trial is an improper opinion.
If I may respond. I can hear you now, Your Honor.
Yes. My connection dropped out partway through Mr. Richardson's argument. So if you can restate your objection, please.
Yes, Your Honor. I objected to an improper opinion. Opposing counsel is asking Mr. Cabrera to make opinion or to give testimony about what might happen in the event of a certain outcome in this case. And because Mr. Cabrera is not a lawyer and has no training in the legal field, such an opinion would be improper.
A response, Your Honor?
Yes.
If Mr. Cabrera doesn't know whether or not that there's an outcome that regarding the estate, he can say so. But we have it on a good faith basis that Miss Mars actually told the witness that there was a question about where the estate would go based on this trial, and I can ask him those specific questions if necessary. But if he doesn't know, he can say so.
Let's focus on those specific questions.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Cabrera, you've spoken to the defendant since the will reading.
One time I did, yes. We had a phone call.
You had a phone call in June of 2020.
Yes.
And Miss Mars, she called you up on the phone.
Yes, I kept tabs on Mars for my writing.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
My apologies, go forward.
She asked you to testify in this trial.
Yes, she knew that I was very close with Agatha and that I had been around for the months leading up to Agatha's passing. And she said that it might be helpful for me to come and say what I knew.
Right, she asked you to testify on her behalf.
Yes, I mean, I was going to tell what I could about my observations. I did. I believe it's important that everyone hear.
Yes. Well, Miss Mars, she offered you whatever you wanted from the estate of Miss Lee.
Well, it wasn't quite an offer. We were discussing afterwards, and I mentioned, really missing Agatha, and that I'm sure she was as well. And she asked if there was anything I'd like from Agatha's house to help remember her.
Well, that's actually not true, Mr. Cabrera. What she really said was, good, I appreciate that. On an unrelated note, is there anything that belonged to Miss Lee that you might like to have?
Yes, circling back to earlier in our conversation when we'd been discussing Agatha's passing.
And you said absolutely, Miss Mars.
Yes, I really was interested in getting access to Agatha's memoir, or well, not memoirs, I was writing those, her unpublished manuscripts that I wanted to frame within memoir structure.
Right. You asked for those unpublished books, and then the defendant told you what to do to get them. Isn't that right, Mr. Cabrera?
Miss Mars told me that I could have the books, she said that she'd be happy to give them to me. There was no of what I needed to do. I'm not sure I understand.
Well, her words were, so long as I'm still in possession of Agatha's estate, at the end of the civil trial, that same civil trial that we're hearing today, those books are yours.
Yeah, so that wasn't any form of what I needed to do. That was just a statement. I mean, she couldn't give me what she didn't have, so.
But that means that you understand that at the end of today's trial, well, Miss Mars, she might have the books or she might not.
That's true. And if she does not, then I would like to make the same offer to Mr. Rogers that I would love to be able to publish those unpublished works of his grandmother's.
But you're not worried about the end of this trial because you're here testifying on Miss Mars's behalf. Isn't that right, Mr. Cabrera?
Yes, I spent 6 months in that house with Agatha and with Drew Mars, and I'm fairly certain there is no way that Drew Mars could have hurt Agatha. And I feel that once the jury has heard Agatha's final moments, it will be clear what really happened.
Agatha's final moments. See, you keep saying that, but I want to talk about what you can and can't tell us now that we know why you're here testifying in the first place. Because you saw Agatha on the 14th, right?
Yes, we had a lunch.
But that was at lunch, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You understand that Miss Lee, she died at night?
Yes, she died in her sleep, I believe.
In her home?
Yes.
Mr. Cabrera, you were never in Agatha's home on the 14th?
Not on the 14th, no.
So if someone took that stand right where you're sitting and said that they saw the defendant creeping from her room towards Miss Lee's at 9:40 p.m. holding something in their hand, well, you couldn't tell us any different.
I suppose not, and I'm not aware of anything that happened in the house that night.
Right, if someone told us that they saw Miss Mars, buying chloroandramine pills on the 14th, well, you couldn't tell us any different.
Your Honor, objection to relevance at this point. The opposing counsel has made it clear that Mr. Cabrera was not at the house on July 18th or 14th, excuse me. So to go into this line of questioning is simply irrelevant at this point.
Your Honor, if I may.
You may.
The witness said that he wanted the jury to hear Miss Lee's final moments on on August 14th. I'm just clarifying what exactly he can and can't tell us about her final moments, considering she died at home in the evening.
I don't think, though, that we need to have you repeat everything that Mr. Rogers said as a question about what he can and can't tell us.
Yes, Your Honor, I'll move on.
I think you've made that point. Let's move on.
Yes, Your Honor.
I just have a few more questions for you then, Mr. Cabrera. Because when you did see Agatha on the 14th, she told you about a plan, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Miss Lee, she told you about a plan when you spoke to her on the 14th?
Not really particularly. I can't think of a specific plan.
Well, she said she was going to call her lawyers, right?
I think so. She mentioned that she had an appointment coming up because we couldn't meet on Friday.
And that appointment that kept her from, excuse me.
I believe there's an objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Going back to the previous question, objection to hearsay to the statements of Agatha Lee saying that they were going to set up this appointment.
Your Honor, I asked in particular about Miss Lee's plan because the statement that I'm trying to elicit is a statement of intent and is an exception to the rule against hearsay under 8033.
Okay. Any response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. We haven't heard any foundation as to whether or not Miss Lee was going to follow through with that plan, how long this plan had been in place, or so therefore it still does not meet the bar for 8033.
I don't think any of that's necessary. Overruled.
So one last question, Mr. Cabrera. She had a plan to meet with her lawyer. She told you that, right?
She told me she had a meeting coming up, I believe.
With her lawyers, just to be clear?
I think so, yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing further.
Thank you. Any redirect examination?
Not at this time, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you very much. Does the defense rest?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense rests its case in chief.
And I believe we are getting close to the all lost time. We have about 11 to 12 minutes left, as I figure. How much time do the parties have for closing arguments?
I believe I have 7 minutes and 13 seconds left. I'm not sure about the defense.
I believe the defense has about 9 minutes, obviously with out regarding all loss.
Yes, we're going to need to cut both of those down. So if we have about 11 minutes left, and given that the defense has more time, I think probably 5 and 6 minutes represent the most that we're going to be able to give either of the two of you. And
I can make that work, Your Honor.
Let's get started right away.
Just a moment. May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury. Without those pills, the defendant was going to lose the will. See, at the beginning of today's trial, the defense said something, and I thought it was interesting, so I wrote it down. They said she wanted to write the end of her own story. But members of the jury, if you paid attention today, well, I think it's clear that Miss Lee, she didn't want to write the end of her own story. She wanted to rewrite her will. But the defendant, well, she didn't let her. Because this case, well, it doesn't begin on August 14th of 2018. It doesn't begin when Agatha Lee starts feeling sick like the defense would have you believe. No, this case begins back in February of 2018 when Miss Lee, a best-selling author, a loving grandmother, an 82-year-old woman just trying to enjoy her retirement, rewrites her will, giving the defendant, Drew Mars, everything, $20 million, her unpublished books, her home. Because Miss Mars, as you heard today, well, she'd been sending money back home, caring for a sick brother with leukemia, and medical expenses were piling up. She needed that money, and she was afraid it was going to come too late. And then things took a turn because Stevie Rogers, Miss Lee's grandson came back to Lee Manor. Stevie and Agatha started getting along. They rekindled their relationship, and Agatha wanted to write him back into the will. August 14th, Agatha and Stevie have a conversation, and Drew Mars is just outside listening, and she hears that she's going to make an appointment with her lawyers. But that won't stand. Because Miss Mars, she needs that money. Her family needs that money, and so does her brother. And so she decides to go buy chloroandramine pills. She swaps out the pills knowing that Miss Lee has a fatal chloroandramine allergy, knowing that those pills look identical to her arthritis medication. She lets Agatha ingest them, and then the next morning she acts like she has no idea what happened. Because without those pills, well, Miss Mars was going to lose that will. That's why we're here in trial today. That's why we, as the plaintiff, are suing Miss Mars. Because here in Midlands, if you're responsible for someone's death, even if you're written into the will, you can't receive its contents. As the plaintiff, we have a burden in today's case. It was our job, our burden to prove to you that the defendant purposely or knowingly caused the death of Miss Lee. And I want to be very clear about exactly what that means. See, a person acts purposefully when they do something hoping for a particular result. And they act knowingly when they do something that they're practically certain will cause a response. Today, members of the jury, we showed you that Miss Mars did both of those things. She acted knowingly when she switched out those Winterin pills for chloroandramine, knowing that Miss Lee's allergy was fatal, and she acted purposefully when she hoped that Miss Lee would die. But members of the jury, this is a civil case. So we've got a very particular burden. See, we don't have to prove this to you beyond a reasonable doubt. No. We have to prove it by what's called a preponderance of the evidence. That's just more likely than not a hair over 50%. So like the judge told you just a few minutes ago, the question you have to answer is whether or not it's more likely that the defendant purposefully or knowingly caused Miss Lee's death. And the answer to that question, well, it becomes pretty obvious if you return to those three questions that my co-counsel asked you at the beginning of today's trial. 1, who knew that Miss Lee had a fatal allergy to a medicine that looked identical to her other arthritis medication before her death? 2, in whose closet did the police find chloroandramine? And 3, who stood to gain $20 million if Miss Lee died before she could meet with her lawyers? The answer? The defendant. The defendant, the defendant. See, it's the defendant that stood to gain. It's the defendant who had chloroandramine in their closet, and it's the defendant who had the knowledge to make this happen. Members of the jury, it's obvious. So when the defense gets up here and they ask you to believe that Miss Lee killed herself, realize that they're not asking you to let her write the end of her own story. They're keeping her from rewriting her will. Thank you.
Argument for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Members of the jury, she wanted to write the end of her own story. And to talk about the story, we really have to go back to 2008. In 2008, Miss Agatha Lee lost her daughter, her closest family member, in a car accident. This devastating loss, unfortunately, didn't stop there either. Because after she lost her daughter, her grandson, Stevie Rogers, completely cut off communication with her. We heard today through Miss Drew Mars that after Stevie Rogers, the plaintiff, stopped talking to her, well, she looked sluggish. She looked downtrodden. She was incredibly upset. And so she sent a letter to the plaintiff saying that she was going to cut him out of the will. And what happened 3 months later? Stevie Rogers showed straight up to the door after spending the entirety of his trust fund. And the plaintiff wanted money. The plaintiff knew that when all else failed, he could go back to his grandmother. Unfortunately, what we found was that Miss Agatha Lee was aware of this. She quickly realized that although she had reconnected with her grandson wanted one thing, and that was her money. We learned about a conversation that took place on August 14th, the day that Miss Lee passed. We learned a conversation about that, well, where Miss Agatha Lee told Stevie Rogers, the plaintiff, that she wasn't changing it. Well, what happened afterwards? We learned from Miss Drew Mars that Miss Lee was even more upset, that she seemed even more concerning, that her behaviors seemed odd, even for someone who has always been sad. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about how this happened. We know that the person who's responsible for the death of Miss Lee, well, they needed to have access to that medication. We know that Miss Lee did. That person needs to know intimately the allergy and how that allergy would have affected her. We learned today that Miss Lee also knew about her allergy. But what's most important is we need someone, or the person who switched those pills, they needed to have time to do so. Time where nobody was around them. Well, what do we hear today? We didn't hear anything about Miss Drew Mars having time to go and switch their medication, but what we did hear was that Miss Agatha Lee decided to take a nap at 2 p.m., something that she never did. When Miss Lee went up to take that nap, there was no one else in the house, and she was all alone. We also learned that she locked the door behind her as she entered into her room, once again, all alone. She asked for a meal for her favorite dinner, one that she has never asked for, and decided that instead of eating with her housekeeper, well, she was going to eat alone in her study. And when that meal was made, Miss Mars was seen on her bed, and it looked like she had been crying. But that leaves an important question. We talked a lot about that bag of pills that was found in Miss Mars's room. Well, how did it get there? Well, what did you hear? We learned from Drew Mars that when she went up to check on Miss Agatha Lee, she noticed that Miss Lee was standing right outside of Miss Mars's bedroom. It was then that Miss Mars dropped the pills off outside of her room. And it also looked like she was holding something. And that something that she was holding was that same bag. And that also leaves us with the question of why. I want to talk a little bit about the book that she wrote, her story. It was about an aging millionaire who died due to a very rare allergy to chloroandramine. And that's exactly what happened in today's case. And that's why that on the last meeting, the day that she passed away, she let Mr. Ryan Cabrera know that she had dozens of unpublished works. And that's a secret that she's only revealed to anybody on that day.
I'm going to cut you off there, counsel, so that we don't run up against all loss. And I understand we won't necessarily have all the ballots in by then. Hopefully the bailiff will convey to the tab room that we are very close. And if the judges have been scoring as we, this will not take more than a moment. I'm going to submit mine to make sure that we do not go over. And if the other judges do so.
Yes, so what we're gonna go ahead and do is I'm gonna stop the live stream now. Teams, you're gonna go back into your breakout rooms, and then once all of the judges' ballots have come in, we are gonna go ahead and begin comments there. So judges, once you've submitted your ballot, please turn on your video, and then I'll bring the students back into the room once we have all of the ballots submitted and I've confirmed with tab room that they've made it there. And Judge Romano, has yours been submitted?
Yes.
Great.